In the glittering halls of ancient Rome, where senators reclined on silk cushions and wine flowed like rivers, dinner was more than a meal. It was theater. The elite didn't just eat to live. They ate to impress, to dominate, to display power. And nothing said opulence quite like the tongue of a flamingo. Served on silver platters, this rare delicacy was prized not for its flavor, but for its symbolism, a bird of grace and beauty, silenced and devoured. These banquets blurred the line between indulgence and absurdity, where extravagance became identity. But why flamingo tongues? What drove Rome's wealthiest citizens to seek such exotic excess? And what do these forgotten feasts reveal about the soul of an empire that consumed everything, even elegance itself? In ancient Rome, the banquet was never just a meal. For the ruling elite, it was a stage on which power, wealth, and influence were displayed with calculated precision. The dining hall, the triclinium, was both the set and the arena, where guests reclined on couches arranged around low tables, their bodies angled toward the center so that every movement, every morsel, was part of a shared spectacle. Here, beneath frescoed walls and coffered ceilings, the host held court, not with the blunt force of law or the rhetoric of the forum, but with the silent authority of abundance. The tradition of the Roman banquet had deep roots in the Republic, influenced by Greek symposia, yet shaped by Rome's unique hunger for spectacle. In the early days, meals of the patrician class were formal but restrained, focused on political conversation and symbolic foods tied to ancestral values. That restraint began to erode as Rome's power expanded. By the 1st century BCE, the influx of wealth from conquered territories and the widening reach of trade routes had transformed the table into an arena of conspicuous consumption. Ingredients from the edges of the empire. Silphium from Cyrenaica, dates from Judea, pepper from India, arrived in the markets of Rome, each bearing the scent and story of conquest. The banquets of the late Republic and the early Empire became acts of competitive magnificence. Senators, generals, and newly enriched equestrians vied to outdo one another, not only in the rarity of the dishes served, but in their presentation. Exotic animals, living or roasted whole, were paraded before guests. Wine was poured from amphorae sealed decades earlier, their age a testament to the host's patience and wealth. Musicians, poets, and acrobats filled the intervals between courses, ensuring that the evening's memories would linger as much in the mind as on the tongue. The dining ritual itself was highly codified. Guests arrived according to a strict hierarchy, their seating reflecting their closeness to the host in status and favor. Reclining on couches covered with embroidered linens, they were attended by slaves trained to move silently, to anticipate needs without command. The host's reputation could rise or fall on the smoothness of service, the sequence of dishes, and the elegance of the entertainment. In this world, a single misstep, a poorly seasoned dish, an inattentive servant, could be as damaging as a political blunder in the Senate. Flamingo tongues entered this theater as one of the most daring expressions of abundance. Flamingos were not native to Rome's immediate surroundings. They thrived in the wetlands of North Africa, Hispania, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Their capture and transport required coordination, expense, and access to networks that spanned seas. To present flamingo tongues at table was to reveal one's reach into the empire's farthest corners, to signal connections with governors, traders, and hunters in distant provinces. The taste of flamingo tongue, according to surviving Roman culinary texts such as those attributed to Apicius, was delicate yet distinctive. It was often simmered gently in a broth of dates, pepper, and vinegar, then finished with garum, the fermented fish sauce that seasoned nearly all Roman dishes. Some recipes called for the addition of costly cinnamon or cloves, their fragrance rising from the plate in a cloud of spice that was as much performance as flavor. The preparation transformed the organ from an anatomical curiosity into a morsel of culinary luxury, served in small portions on silver or gold dishes. The inclusion of such a delicacy in a banquet menu was deliberate, almost theatrical in its timing. Flamingo tongues were rarely served at the beginning of the meal. They appeared after the guests had been lulled into a rhythm by other courses: oysters, roasted fowl, stews of exotic game. The arrival of the tongues was often accompanied by a change in the entertainment. A shift from music to poetry, or from poetry to a dramatic reading. The effect was to heighten the sense of occasion, to frame the dish as both a gustatory and cultural climax. It is important to note that Roman banquets were not private indulgences in the modern sense. Though held within a domus, they were semi-public affairs, stages for cultivating alliances and shaping public perception. News of an extraordinary feast would spread quickly through the city, carried by guests and servants alike, magnifying the host's prestige far beyond those present. To serve flamingo tongues was to inscribe one's name in the ongoing contest of Roman social memory, a contest where generosity and ostentation were weapons as sharp as any gladius. The historian Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, could not resist commenting on the extravagance of his contemporaries, lamenting the Roman tendency to elevate rarity over reason. He mentioned flamingo tongues as an example of how desire for the unusual had overcome practicality and how luxury had eroded the virtues of earlier generations. Yet such criticism did little to diminish the appetite for the exotic. In fact, moral disapproval often enhanced a dish's desirability. To serve what others called excessive was, in the eyes of some hosts, a mark of boldness and superiority. In this way, the Roman banquet was a paradox. It was both inclusive and exclusive, a gathering meant to display the host's generosity while reinforcing the social barriers between those who could recline in the triclinium and those who served at its edges. The flamingo tongues, for all their delicate seasoning, were thus more than a delicacy. They were symbols. Symbols of an empire that could bend nature to its will, that could take a bird from a distant marsh and make its tongue a momentary jewel on the tongue of a senator. In understanding the role of such feasts, one begins to see how Rome sustained its elite's cohesion and authority. The Senate chamber and the battlefield forged laws and empires, but the dining room sustained the networks that kept them in place. And in the soft flesh of a flamingo tongue, set against silver and spice, lay the distilled essence of that system: opulence as strategy, flavor as power. The journey of a flamingo's tongue from the shimmering shallows of a distant marsh to the polished silver platter of a Roman triclinium was a feat of coordination, wealth, and imperial infrastructure. It began far from the marble temples and colonnaded streets of the capital, in the warm wetlands of Africa, Hispania, and the eastern Mediterranean. There, among reeds and salt flats, the long-legged birds fed in flocks, their curved bills sifting algae, crustaceans, and small mollusks from shallow water. The very pigments of their prey gave flamingos their striking pink hue, a color that in Roman eyes symbolized rarity, exoticism, and the power to command nature's beauty. The hunters who sought them worked in secrecy and skill. Flamingos were wary and fast to take flight, and their marshland habitats were treacherous to navigate. Some were captured alive using nets strung between reed beds, driven into enclosures by coordinated teams in shallow boats. Others were felled with arrows, the hunters wading silently through knee-deep mud before striking. Alive or dead, the birds represented a rare commodity. In some provinces, their capture was regulated by local authorities, often under the control of governors who saw in these delicacies a way to curry favor with Rome's upper class. Once in hand, the challenge became preservation. Live flamingos were sometimes kept in captivity near coastal ports, their diet maintained to preserve the distinctive coloration that marked their prestige. The tongues, however, were so delicate that they required careful handling. In some cases, the entire head was preserved in brine for transport, the flesh later simmered gently to extract the prized organ. More often, the birds were butchered on site, the tongue salted, wrapped in oil-soaked cloth, and packed in amphorae sealed with wax. These amphorae, bearing the painted marks of merchants, would begin their long voyage across the empire's arteries of trade. The network that moved such goods was one of Rome's greatest strengths. From the harbors of North Africa, Hispania, or Egypt, merchant ships loaded with grain, wine, oil, and the occasional amphora of flamingo tongues would set sail for Ostia, Rome's bustling port at the mouth of the Tiber. The voyage could take weeks, subject to weather and the hazards of piracy, though the latter had been drastically reduced since Pompey's naval campaigns in the 1st century BCE. Upon arrival, cargo was inspected, taxed, and transferred onto river barges for the slow push upstream to the city itself. Merchants who specialized in luxury goods knew the value of scarcity. They kept detailed records of who had purchased such delicacies before, cultivating relationships with senatorial households and wealthy equestrians. A shipment of flamingo tongues might be offered quietly to a patron known for extravagant entertainments, the promise of exclusivity adding to the price. Payment was often made not only in coin but in reciprocal favors, introductions to influential allies, invitations to politically advantageous gatherings, or access to other rare imports. The cooks who ultimately prepared these tongues were themselves part of the network of prestige. The best chefs in Rome were often slaves or freedmen from Greece, Asia Minor, or North Africa, prized for their skill and knowledge of foreign spices. A master cook would know not only how to prepare the tongues to the tender point of perfection, but how to present them in a way that heightened the drama of the banquet. A common method was to arrange them on a platter of finely worked silver, garnished with pomegranate seeds for color and fresh bay leaves for fragrance. The sauce, a blend of pepper, honey, garum, and sharp vinegar, was served alongside, allowing guests to savor the flavor in contrast to the rich, velvety texture of the meat. Behind each such presentation lay a chain of human effort: the hunters in the marsh, the merchants on the docks, the sailors at sea, the traders in Rome's markets, and the household staff who prepared and served the dish. Every stage carried risk, spoilage, loss to storms, or interception by rival buyers. The fact that a flamingo tongue could appear on a Roman table at all was a triumph of the empire's logistical reach. The economics of such delicacies were as calculated as their presentation. While the price of a flamingo tongue is not recorded in surviving sources, comparable luxury foods like peacock brains or parrotfish livers fetched sums that could feed an ordinary family for months. To serve them in quantity, as some hosts did, offering each guest not one but several tongues, was an act of spending designed to be talked about for years afterward. It was conspicuous consumption in its purest form, an edible declaration that the host's resources were so vast they could be squandered on something so fleeting. Yet the demand for such goods also tells a story about Rome's social fabric. In a society where public political life was dominated by a small elite, the private sphere became an arena where influence could be built or eroded. The offering of a rare dish was a subtle invitation: partake of this luxury, and remember who gave it to you. For ambitious men and women, such gestures could bind allies more tightly than formal contracts. This network of acquisition and presentation also reveals something about Rome's relationship with its provinces. Flamingos thrived in lands that had once been foreign to Rome, and their tongues traveled along routes secured by conquest. The delicacy thus embodied the empire's expansion, both a literal product of distant lands and a metaphor for the way Rome absorbed and repurposed the natural and cultural wealth of the territories it ruled. In the bite of a flamingo tongue was the taste of empire, distant labor, controlled movement, and the transformation of the exotic into the familiar for those in power. The presence of such foods at table also had a performative political dimension. Governors who sent shipments of rare goods to Rome strengthened their ties to the capital. Generals returning from campaigns often brought with them exotic animals and foods as part of their triumphal processions, reinforcing the idea that military victory translated into sensory abundance for the elite. The flamingo tongue might not have appeared in the formal lists of war spoils, but its arrival in a patrician's dining room was no less a symbol of conquest. Thus, when guests reclined in the triclinium and tasted the soft, spice-infused flesh, they were consuming more than a delicacy. They were consuming proof of Rome's reach, the efficiency of its supply chains, and the willingness of its leaders to turn the farthest edges of the known world into a source of personal prestige. The marsh and the marble table were linked by a chain as strong as iron and as delicate as the dish itself. In the annals of Roman gastronomy, no name carries more weight or notoriety than that of Marcus Gavius Apicius. A wealthy epicure living during the reign of Tiberius in the early 1st century CE, Apicius was less a cook than a patron saint of indulgence. His life became legend. The man who sailed to North Africa solely to taste a rare species of shrimp, only to turn back when the catch failed to meet his expectations. The man who allegedly spent a fortune on banquets so extravagant that, facing financial decline, he chose to end his life rather than live without luxury. Whether all the stories are true hardly matters. They reveal how deeply Romans associated the art of the table with the art of living. It is through Apicius, or at least the compilation of recipes that bears his name, that we catch a glimpse of how dishes like flamingo tongues were elevated from curiosities to emblems of cultural power. The Dowry Coquinaria, on the subject of cooking, is a collection of hundreds of recipes attributed to him, though the surviving text is likely a later compilation drawing on multiple sources. In it, the preparation of flamingo is treated with the same seriousness as lamb or fish. The bird is boiled, seasoned with pepper, mint, and rue, sweetened with dates, and finished with vinegar and garum. The tongue, prized for its delicate texture, was prepared in much the same way. Cooked just enough to preserve tenderness, then cloaked in a sauce whose complexity mirrored the sophistication of the host. Roman cuisine, especially at the elite level, was an alchemy of opposites, sweet and sour, hot and cool, familiar and exotic. The goal was not merely to satisfy hunger, but to surprise, to delight, and to provoke conversation. Ingredients from the far corners of the empire were combined in ways that flaunted both the cook's skill and the host's reach. Cinnamon from India met honey from Hispania, vinegar from Crete mingled with olives from Campania, and all of it was bound together with garum, the ubiquitous fermented fish sauce whose pungency was as essential to Roman cooking as salt is to ours. In this world, the flamingo tongue was a perfect canvas for culinary display. It was small enough to serve in individual portions, lending itself to artful plating. It carried a subtle flavor that absorbed seasoning readily, allowing a chef to layer tastes without overwhelming the natural delicacy of the meat. Most importantly, it was rare, ensuring that few guests had tasted it often enough to form fixed expectations. A skilled cook could thus shape the entire experience, from the first scent rising from the platter to the lingering taste on the tongue, and, in doing so, enhance the prestige of the patron who had provided it. The relationship between chefs and patrons in Rome was a dynamic of mutual advantage. Many of the most celebrated cooks were enslaved men trained from youth in the kitchens of great houses. Their talents could elevate the standing of their owners, attracting guests eager to sample their creations. Some cooks, upon being freed, opened public dining establishments or worked freelance for multiple patrons, commanding high fees for their services. Recipes, too, became a form of currency. To know a unique preparation for a rare ingredient was to hold a bargaining chip in the competitive economy of elite hospitality. Apicius' influence extended beyond recipes to the very philosophy of dining. He and those like him understood that the banquet was a total work of art, the interplay of setting, service, food, and conversation. A dish like flamingo tongues was not simply brought to table, it was staged. The serving vessels might be gilded or inlaid with precious stones, the sauce poured at the table so that its aroma enveloped the diners. Slaves might circulate with censers of burning myrrh, blending fragrance with flavor. The act of eating became an immersive performance, engaging all the senses. Critics of such extravagance were not few. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, mocked the excesses of the wealthy, noting how fortunes were squandered on ingredients that offered no greater nourishment than the simplest grain. He saw in dishes like flamingo tongues a symptom of moral decay, evidence that the ruling class had lost sight of the virtues that had built the republic. But to the hosts who served them, such criticism only underscored their ability to defy conventional morality. To indulge in what others condemned was to assert independence from the constraints of ordinary life, a privilege reserved for the powerful. In the broader context of Roman culture, Apicius' legacy and the culinary arts he championed reflected a civilization at its zenith, confident enough to play with its food as much as with its politics. The empire's conquests had filled its markets with wonders, and its cooks transformed those wonders into edible symbols of domination and refinement. To prepare a flamingo tongue in the Apician style was to participate in this grand narrative, to take something rare and distant, to manipulate it with skill and imagination, and to present it as an experience that bound the eater to the empire itself. It is telling that the Diary Coquinaria contains no moral reflection on the consumption of such rarities. There is no sense of restraint, no suggestion that one should consider the cost or scarcity of the ingredient. In this, the cookbook mirrors the ethos of its intended audience, the wealthy, for whom the question was never should we, but only how best can we. This attitude made Flamingo tongues not just a delicacy, but a declaration that the resources of the known world could be summoned to a single table, that nature could be bent to the will of those who ruled. Thus, through Apicius and the culture he represented, the flamingo tongue was transformed from an anatomical curiosity into a culinary icon. It was no longer merely the organ of a bird from a far-off marsh. It was the embodiment of Rome's appetite for mastery, artistry, and the theater of excess. And in the warm lamplight of the triclinium, as guests lifted the morsel to their lips, they tasted not just spice and meat, but the distilled essence of an empire at feast. To understand the place of flamingo tongues in Roman society, one must first understand the banquet as a meticulously choreographed performance, one in which every element, from the seating of the guests to the sequencing of the courses, conveyed meaning. The Latin word for such a feast was convivium, literally living together, but the reality was far from an egalitarian gathering. The banquet was a theater of hierarchy, where proximity to the host, the quality of one's food, and even the manner in which it was served revealed one's position in the social order. The process began long before a guest reclined on the couch. Invitations were not sent casually, but delivered with an awareness of political and personal consequence. To be invited to dine with a senator, a general, or an influential patron was both an honor and an opportunity. Declining could be a calculated insult. Accepting meant entering a stage on which your every reaction would be observed. The guest list itself was a display of the host's network, allies, rivals, clients, and occasionally foreign dignitaries who could carry tales of Roman grandeur back to their homelands. When the evening arrived, guests would be greeted at the atrium, the open reception hall, often by the host himself or by an attendant trained in ceremony. Before entering the triclinium, the dining room, they might pause to wash their hands in scented water, an act both of cleanliness and ritual. The triclinium was arranged with 3 couches forming a U-shape around a low table, the open side allowing servants to approach with dishes. The seating was deliberate. The host occupied the central position on the couch of honor, flanked by those he wished to favor. Lesser guests found themselves further from the host, and, crucially, further from the best dishes. Once the guests had reclined, on their left elbows, leaving the right hand free for eating, the banquet could begin. It unfolded in stages, each with its own rhythms. The gustatio opened the evening, a course of appetizers meant to stimulate appetite, eggs seasoned with garum, olives from the Sabine Hills, and small fish or shellfish dressed with herbs. Wine, often diluted with water and infused with honey or spices, flowed freely from the start, loosening tongues and easing the formalities of conversation. The next act was the prima mensa, the main course. Here the host could display his full command of the culinary arts. Large platters of roasted meats, stews rich with exotic spices, and fresh vegetables from his estates were paraded into the room, each announced by the aroma that preceded it. It was within this main course, often toward its climax, that the flamingo tongues might appear. Their arrival was calculated for maximum effect. The serving slaves, dressed in fine tunics, or even costumes for thematic banquets, would carry in ornate dishes covered with lids of silver or bronze. At a signal, the lids were lifted, releasing a waft of steam and spice that instantly drew every eye. The tongues themselves, small and curved, might be arranged in patterns, a spiral evoking the bird's long neck, or a fan reminiscent of its wings. They would be bathed in a sauce of Apician complexity, pepper, mint, dates, vinegar, and the ever-present garum, the colors glistening in the lamplight. For guests who had never tasted them, the moment carried a charge of curiosity and trepidation. For those who had, it was an opportunity to compare this preparation to others, to praise or subtly critique the chef, and thereby signal their own sophistication. After the main course came the secunda mensa, the dessert stage. Roman desserts were not the sugared confections of later European tradition, but a lighter, often fruit-based coda to the meal: figs, grapes, nuts, honeyed pastries, and cheeses. By this time, wine had loosened the room into a more convivial atmosphere, and conversation might drift from politics to poetry, from the day's news to philosophical debate. Entertainment, musicians, dancers, acrobats, or even staged readings might accompany this final course, reinforcing the banquet as a total sensory experience. The flamingo tongues, therefore, were positioned not merely as food but as narrative devices within the banquet's progression. They were a turning point, a crescendo in the culinary symphony, after which the meal could glide toward its gentler conclusion. Their rarity and cost amplified their impact. Few outside the highest echelons could claim to have tasted them, and even fewer could boast of having done so in so refined a setting. The logistics of such a dish were formidable. Flamingos were not native to the heartlands of Italy. They had to be sourced from the wetlands of North Africa, the Nile Delta, or distant parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Capturing and transporting live birds was costly and impractical, so the tongues would typically be taken soon after the bird was killed, preserved in brine or packed in cooled amphorae with layers of aromatic herbs. To present them fresh, a feat sometimes achieved through rapid transport and careful handling, was to elevate the display of wealth to an even higher level. All of this unfolded under the watchful eyes of the other guests. Every reaction, a widening of the eyes, a murmured compliment, a slow savoring of the bite, reinforced the host's success. To serve flamingo tongues was to make a promise that the rest of the evening would match their rarity and refinement. To fail in the execution, to present them overcooked, underseasoned, or in an unworthy sauce, was to invite not only disappointment but quiet mockery in the social circles where reputation was currency. Even the act of reclining to eat shaped the experience. This posture, adopted from Greek custom, allowed diners to focus entirely on the sensory pleasures of the meal, freed from the utilitarian upright position of the working classes. Eating became a languid, almost ritualized act, in which a single bite of a rare delicacy could be rolled slowly across the palate, its nuances discussed as one might discuss a fine vintage of wine. In this setting, the flamingo tongue became a talking point, a shared point of reference for commentary that could range from the merits of apicious recipes to reflections on the reach of Roman power. In the end, the banquet was less about the food than about what the food communicated. To orchestrate the appearance of flamingo tongues in the prima mensa was to master the grammar of Roman social display. It was to weave a message of wealth, taste, and command into the very fabric of the evening, ensuring that when the guests departed into the night, their minds would linger as much on the host's status as on the flavor that had graced their tongues. The flamingo tongues that graced the tables of Rome's most opulent banquets were more than just rare morsels. They were the product of an immense, intricate, and costly web of trade that spanned the length and breadth of the Roman Empire. To understand how such a delicacy could appear, seemingly effortlessly, in the gilded triclinium of a senator's home is to appreciate the logistical genius and the political might that sustained Rome's appetite for the extraordinary. Rome's reach was vast, encompassing territories that stretched from the mist-shrouded Isles of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Arabia. This geographic diversity was the empire's greatest culinary asset. It allowed for the gathering of ingredients from climates and ecosystems far beyond Italy's own, each carrying a unique story and prestige. Flamingos, with their startling pink plumage and long, graceful necks, thrived in wetlands. From the lagoons of North Africa to the river deltas of the eastern Mediterranean, and even in the salt lakes of Hispania, these were the hunting grounds for the suppliers who fed Rome's demand. The process began far from the marble forums and colonnaded villas of the capital. In the shallow, briny lagoons of Mauritania or the marshes along the Nile Delta, hunters skilled in capturing waterfowl would set out in reed boats at dawn. Flamingos were cautious, their colonies often positioned in places difficult for predators, human or otherwise, to reach. The hunters used nets, bait, and sometimes fire to drive the birds into enclosures. The most prized specimens were those with the deepest coloration, a sign of their diet rich in brine shrimp and algae, and, according to Roman belief, of the most flavorful tongues. Once captured, the birds were slaughtered on site. The tongues, being small and delicate, were removed with precision to prevent damage. Preservation was critical. A journey from Africa to Rome could take weeks. In cooler months, they were packed in amphorae layered with coarse salt and aromatic herbs such as thyme and bay leaf, which slowed decay and imparted subtle flavors. In summer, shipments moved at greater risk, necessitating faster transport, often on ships prioritized for luxury goods rather than bulk commodities. Here the empire's infrastructure came into play. Roman engineering was as much a servant of taste as of conquest. The vie, or roads, that radiated from the capital allowed goods to move swiftly once they reached the Italian coast. In the great ports, Ostia for Rome itself, Puteoli for much of Campania, warehouses stored delicacies until they were called for by merchants or directly by elite households. The ports bustled with goods from every corner of the empire. Amphorae of wine from Gaul, garum from Hispania, spices from Arabia and India, and, in small, heavily guarded consignments, the tongues of flamingos from Africa or the East. The movement of such rare ingredients was also a matter of trust. The Roman elite relied on networks of traders, freedmen, and agents to ensure that what was promised was what was delivered. Fraud was common in the luxury trade. An unscrupulous supplier might substitute goose or swan tongues for those of the flamingo, counting on the inexperience of some clients. To avoid such humiliation, wealthy patrons cultivated personal relationships with reliable suppliers, often through the patronage system that bound much of Roman commerce. Cost, of course, was part of the allure. A dish that could be replicated cheaply lost its power as a status symbol. In the markets of Rome, a single flamingo tongue might fetch a sum equal to a laborer's weekly wage. To serve dozens at once was an act of conspicuous expenditure, akin to scattering gold coins before one's guests. In some cases, the expense was borne not merely for indulgence, but as an investment in political capital. A spectacular banquet could win the loyalty of clients, the admiration of allies, and the grudging respect of rivals. The taste for such luxuries was further stoked by Rome's cultural habit of celebrating conquest through cuisine. Each new province added to the empire's dominion brought with it unfamiliar flavors and ingredients. The general who subdued a region might return not only with tribute in gold or slaves, but with the seeds, animals, and recipes that would thrill Rome's jaded palates. The flamingo itself may have entered Roman gastronomy through early contacts with Egypt and North Africa, lands long known for their exotic bird life. As Rome's political control expanded, so too did its capacity to demand tribute in the form of delicacies. A system that blurred the line between taxation and culinary indulgence. But the supply lines were fragile. A bad season in the wetlands, political unrest in a province, or piracy along the shipping routes could disrupt the flow of such luxuries. In those times, the value, and therefore the prestige, of flamingo tongues only increased. A host who could produce them during a shortage demonstrated not just wealth, but influence strong enough to command scarce resources against the odds. It was a reminder that in Rome, control over the exotic and the rare was a form of soft power as potent as military strength. Even the final leg of the journey was imbued with ceremony. When a shipment of tongues arrived at a noble's household, the amphorae were opened in the presence of the steward, who would inspect them for freshness and quality. The kitchen staff, often slaves trained in the finest culinary arts, would set to work at once, carefully trimming and cleaning each tongue before marinating or seasoning it for the banquet to come. The knowledge that the journey from a distant lagoon to the polished marble table had been made without spoilage or compromise added to the dish's mystique. In this way, the flamingo tongue was not merely an ingredient. It was the visible end of a chain that stretched across seas, over roads, and through the political and economic structures of an empire. To taste it was to taste the reach of Rome itself, the product of conquest, engineering, commerce, and a culture that measured greatness not only in battles won, but in flavors brought home from the edges of the known world. The fact that such a chain could exist at all was a testament to the centralization and stability of the Roman system during its height. Later generations, Looking back from an age when roads crumbled, ports fell silent, and the flamingo tongue vanished from the repertoire of even the wealthiest tables, would see in it a symbol of the empire's former grandeur. The dish was both an extravagance and a fragile miracle, sustained by the will and wealth of a civilization determined to turn the world's most distant treasures into the most intimate of pleasures. In the bustling kitchens of Rome's elite villas, the preparation of flamingo tongues was more than mere cooking. It was an act of culinary theater, an alchemy that transformed a rare and delicate ingredient into a dish worthy of the empire's most discerning palates. The head cook, often a slave or freedman trained over decades, stood as both craftsman and artist, presiding over a space that was the unseen heart of the Roman banquet. The kitchens themselves were marvels of organization and activity. Built with open hearths, clay ovens, and marble-work surfaces, they echoed with the clatter of bronze pans and the hiss of liquids meeting hot metal. Amphorae of oil, jars of garum, bundles of herbs, and bowls of spices from across the empire were arranged for easy reach. The preparation of flamingo tongues began long before the guests reclined in the triclinium. When the shipment arrived, the tongues were inspected for size, color, and firmness. Those that passed the steward's scrutiny were rinsed in cold water and laid out on polished platters, a blush of pink against the gleam of bronze or silver. Roman cooks believed that the tongue of the flamingo carried an inherently delicate flavor, one that should be enhanced but not overpowered. The most common preparation involved a marinade of defrutum, a rich, concentrated grape syrup, mixed with black pepper, cumin, and a touch of asafoetida, a pungent resin imported from the East. This combination balanced sweetness, spice, and an earthy depth, creating a profile that Romans described as suavis et fortis, both gentle and strong. The tongues were steeped in this mixture for hours, sometimes overnight, allowing the flavors to infuse into every tender fiber. Cooking was often done over a controlled charcoal fire. The tongues might be quickly seared on a bronze griddle to lock in moisture, then finished in a covered pot with a small amount of the marinade, allowing them to braise gently until they reached a texture that was neither too firm nor too yielding. Some recipes, preserved in fragments of Apicius's famous cookbook, called for them to be poached in wine with leeks and coriander before being served cold with a drizzle of honey vinegar reduction. Presentation was as critical as flavor. The tongues were arranged on platters in geometric patterns, often interspersed with edible garnishes, slices of fig, sprigs of fresh dill, or petals of violets and roses. The bright pink of the tongues, softened by cooking but still vivid, contrasted with the greens and purples of the garnishes, making the dish as much a visual delight as a gustatory one. For especially lavish feasts, the tongues were served on plates of imported silver or gold, sometimes engraved with scenes from mythology that guests could admire between bites. Serving flamingo tongues was also a moment for the ministry, the household servants trained in the art of banquet service, to shine. They carried the platters into the triclinium in a carefully choreographed procession, their movements synchronized to maintain an air of ceremony. The host or a trusted steward would introduce the dish, perhaps mentioning the origin of the birds, the Nile Delta, the marshes of Mauritania, or the salt lakes of Hispania, to remind guests of the effort and reach involved in securing such a rarity. The first taste was often accompanied by murmurs of appreciation, both for the flavor and for the statement the dish made. In Rome's culture of dining, every bite was political. A guest who praised the flamingo tongues was, in a sense, acknowledging the host's power and refinement. A rival might smile thinly, feigning admiration while calculating the cost and connections required to match or surpass such an offering at their own table. But the culinary mastery went beyond taste and display. Flamingo tongues were notoriously easy to overcook, turning tough and losing their subtle flavor. The best cooks knew precisely when to remove them from the heat, relying not on timers but on the feel of the meat under a probing finger or the aroma rising from the pan. In an age before thermometers, such skill was the mark of a true professional, one whose talents could elevate a household's prestige as much as the host's own political alliances. Flavors, too, told their own story. The use of pepper, imported at great cost from India, underscored the global reach of Rome's trade. The asafoetida, carried overland through Parthian territories, was a spice so valued that it could rival silver in weight. The honey used in some recipes might come from Sicily or Crete, famed for their apiaries, while the wine for poaching could be a vintage from Falernian hills, prized above all others. In a single dish, the empire's geography and economy came together in a sensory tapestry. Some variations were designed to surprise. At certain feasts, the tongues were encased in pastry, emerging as part of a larger pie filled with other exotic meats. At others, they were skewered with quail eggs and small olives, a nod to the Roman love of combining textures and flavors in unexpected ways. The aim was always to delight the palate while reinforcing the host's reputation for innovation and taste. The symbolism of the flamingo itself also played into the dish's appeal. The bird's bright plumage and graceful stance were associated with beauty, rarity, and the exotic. Serving its tongue, the part believed to embody its essence of flavor, was a subtle claim to possessing the finest and most desirable aspects of the natural world. In Rome's language of luxury, it was not enough to own or display something rare. One had to consume it, to make it part of oneself, in order to fully claim its prestige. Behind the scenes, the cooks themselves could achieve considerable fame. Some were bought and sold for fortunes, their skills as prized as those of a skilled orator or architect. A cook who mastered the preparation of flamingo tongues might be whispered about in elite circles. His name passed between households eager to secure his services. For these culinary artists, the kitchen was both a prison and a stage, a place where they could never sit among the guests yet could nonetheless shape the memory of the feast. In the end, the magic of the flamingo tongue lay in the combination of rarity, preparation, and presentation. It was not simply the bird's scarcity that made it valuable, nor the complexity of the cooking alone. It was the interplay between ingredient and artistry, the transformation of a distant marshland's inhabitant into a morsel that could command silence in a room full of Rome's most powerful men and women. The dish was an edible symbol of everything the Roman elite held dear: mastery over nature, command of resources, and the ability to turn even the smallest fragment of the world into a testament of their greatness. In the Rome of the late Republic and early Empire, the banquet table was as much a political arena as the Senate or the battlefield. Here, alliances were forged, reputations built or destroyed, and influence extended over wine, conversation, and the artful arrangement of dishes. To the uninitiated, a feast might appear as mere indulgence, a display of opulence meant to impress or intimidate. But to Rome's elite, it was a carefully orchestrated theater in which every seat, every course, and every toast carried a calculated purpose. The triclinium itself, with its 3 couches arranged around a low table, was a stage upon which political dramas unfolded. Seating was never random. It was an unspoken map of hierarchy and favor. The host occupied a central position, flanked by the most honored guests, whose proximity to the host spoke volumes about their standing. Lower-ranked attendees were placed further away, their status reflected in the quality of the dishes and wine they received. At the very edges, sometimes relegated to the periphery of the conversation, sat those who sought the host's favor or whose presence was a concession to political necessity rather than personal affection. The menu was equally political. To serve flamingo tongues was to send a message not only of wealth but of reach, a subtle assertion that the host commanded resources and connections far beyond the city. It suggested that his ships sailed to Africa's coasts, that his agents traded in the markets of Alexandria, and that his purse could outbid others for the rarest commodities. Such a display could bolster his standing among allies, provoke envy in rivals, and remind dependents of the benefits of loyalty. These banquets were rarely private affairs. News of them traveled quickly through Rome's dense networks of gossip and patronage. An extravagant feast might be recounted in the baths the next morning, each dish described in detail, each guest named, and their seating noted. In such an environment, the host's reputation was shaped as much by what was said after the feast as by what occurred during it. A successful banquet could cement one's image as a man of taste, influence, and generosity. A poorly executed one could suggest miserliness, incompetence, or worse, a decline in fortune. Wine flowed as freely as conversation, loosening tongues and making guests more receptive to persuasion. Business propositions might be floated between courses, political alliances reinforced with promises whispered over honey cakes, and disputes quietly resolved before they could erupt into public scandal. For some, the banquet was an opportunity to lobby for military commands, judicial appointments, or lucrative contracts. For others, it was a chance to gauge the mood of the elite, to see who was in favor and who had fallen from grace. Entertainment played its own role in this political theater. Musicians, poets, and dancers were not merely diversions. They were part of the message. A poet reciting verses in praise of the host's ancestry reinforced claims of noble lineage. A musician performing pieces imported from distant provinces signaled cultural sophistication and imperial reach. Even the choice of entertainers could align the host with certain political factions or philosophical schools. The most skillful hosts used the banquet to weave a narrative about themselves. The progression of courses could mirror the expansion of the Roman Empire, starting with simple, local fare and culminating in exotic dishes from the farthest provinces. In this way, the meal became a metaphor for conquest and dominion, with the host positioned as a miniature emperor presiding over his own empire of flavors and alliances. Yet there were risks. Excessive ostentation could backfire, drawing the attention of moralists who decried luxury as a sign of decadence and moral decline. In the time of the Republic, figures like Cato the Elder railed against such extravagance, warning that it sapped the virtue of Rome's citizens and made them soft. Even under the empire, emperors occasionally imposed sumptuary laws, limiting the amount one could spend on banquets in an effort, often futile, to curb the competitive excess of the elite. A host had to balance the desire to impress with the need to avoid accusations of hubris or disrespect for tradition. The flamingo tongue itself became a kind of political symbol, both admired and criticized. To serve it was to demonstrate power. To abstain from it could be framed as a gesture of austerity and moral superiority. Some senators used their feasts to align themselves with the old Republican virtues, offering simpler fare as a subtle critique of their rivals' excesses. Others embraced the full splendor of the imperial age, using rare delicacies to signal their closeness to the emperor and their command over the empire's resources. Even the act of invitation was laden with meaning. To be invited to a banquet where flamingo tongues were served was to be counted among the inner circle, a sign of favor that could elevate one's standing in the city. To be excluded was often a deliberate slight, a public statement of disfavor, or a calculated move to distance oneself from a political liability. Such decisions could ripple outward, influencing alliances and shaping the balance of power in subtle but significant ways. The political value of the banquet extended beyond Rome itself. Provincial governors, military commanders, and foreign dignitaries all understood the language of the Roman table. To be served flamingo tongues in a distant outpost was to be reminded of Rome's reach and the host's connection to its heart. These feasts were tools of diplomacy as much as of domestic politics, reinforcing the bonds that held the empire together while also projecting its culture and values outward. At its core, the Roman banquet was about control of resources, of information, of appearances. The flamingo tongue, delicate and rare, was a weapon in this arsenal, a way to shape perceptions and secure advantage without a single word being spoken. It was proof that the host could command the farthest corners of the empire and bend them to his will, even if only for the span of a single evening. In such a world, the clink of cups and the murmur of conversation were not mere background noise. They were the sounds of power and motion, of influence being traded as surely as any coin in the marketplace. And in the center of it all, on a gleaming platter, lay the tongues of flamingos, not just food, but a statement, a promise, and a challenge, all in one. Behind every glittering Roman banquet, behind every platter of flamingo tongues or steaming amphora of spiced wine, there was an army of unseen hands, and at its head, the Magister Cocchini, the master of the kitchen. These were not humble cooks in the modern sense. In the Rome of the Caesars, a truly skilled chef could be as valued as a poet, a sculptor, or a military commander. His domain was a world of fire and bronze, smoke and spice, where artistry and logistics intertwined to create evenings that could secure an aristocrat's fortune or ruin it in a single course. The kitchens of Rome's elite were sprawling, complex spaces. In wealthy villas, they were often positioned away from the main triclinium to keep the heat, noise, and smoke from disturbing the guests. Yet they were close enough for dishes to be carried swiftly to the table before they cooled. In these chambers, a hierarchy reigned. Apprentices and slaves prepared basic ingredients. Skilled assistants handled delicate tasks like filleting fish or crushing spices. And the master chef orchestrated it all, calling out orders with the precision of a centurion on the battlefield. The preparation of flamingo tongues was a particular art, requiring both anatomical precision and mastery of flavor. The tongues, small and delicate, had to be removed without damaging the surrounding tissue, then marinated in mixtures of garum, the pungent fermented fish sauce beloved by Romans, honey, and exotic spices imported from Arabia or India. The cooking itself was a balance of heat and timing. Too long over the brazier and the tongues would toughen. Too little, and they would lack the rich, yielding texture that connoisseurs expected. These chefs guarded their recipes jealously. A single innovation, a new sauce, an unusual combination of herbs, could make a reputation and ensure a lifetime of patronage. Some became minor celebrities in their own right, courted by rival households who offered vast sums for their services. There are accounts of wealthy patrons purchasing entire teams of cooks from defeated rivals, as one might acquire prized racehorses or gladiators. The value of such culinary talent was measured not only in coins, but in the social victories their creations could win. The imperial kitchens of the Caesars dwarfed even the grandest private operations. Here, the resources of an empire flowed in daily. Amphorae of wine from Gaul, honey from Hispania, olives from Greece, pepper from India, dates from the deserts of Syria, and, for the most lavish occasions, shipments of flamingos from North Africa. Coordinating such abundance required a logistical genius. Orders had to be timed to account for the speed of ships and caravans, storage conditions had to be precise to prevent spoilage, and substitutions found when weather or war disrupted the flow of goods. The master chefs of the imperial court often came from the ranks of freedmen, former slaves who had proven their worth through years of service. For them, culinary mastery was a path to influence and security. A trusted chef could gain access to the emperor's inner circle, overhearing conversations and winning favors that others could only dream of. Some used their position to advance relatives, secure patronage for allies, or even act as intermediaries in political intrigues. The culinary culture of Rome was also a crucible of experimentation. Influences from across the empire collided in the kitchens. Greek techniques of roasting and seasoning, Egyptian uses of aromatic herbs, Persian methods of combining sweet and savory, and African innovations in spice blends. The flamingo tongue, though a rarity, became a canvas for such experimentation. In some households, it was served glazed with pomegranate syrup. In others, dusted with crushed peppercorns and coriander. In still others, paired with a sauce of reduced wine and aged garum so pungent that it clung to the air long after the dish was removed. Banquets were rehearsed as meticulously as theatrical performances. Dishes had to arrive in precise order, with each course building upon the last in both flavor and spectacle. For a dish like flamingo tongues, timing was critical. They might appear as the centerpiece of the second course, accompanied by music and an unexpected flourish, such as servants dressed in exotic costumes representing the lands from which the birds had come. The drama was as much a part of the dish as the taste itself. The kitchen, however, could also be a place of danger. Fires were a constant risk, and the heat of the braziers was relentless. Knives, boiling oils, and heavy pots made injury common. There was also the ever-present threat of poisoning, whether accidental, from spoiled ingredients, or deliberate, as a tool of political assassination. In such an environment, trust between a patron and his chef was essential. The master chef was not only the guardian of flavor, but the guardian of life. Even for all its risks, the kitchen was a place of pride. Culinary manuscripts, part instruction, part self-promotion, circulated among the elite, detailing elaborate recipes that could be recreated by those with the means. The most famous of these, attributed to Apicius, includes dishes that echo the sensibilities of the imperial age, layers of complex flavors, extravagant use of imported goods, and an emphasis on presentation that mirrored the grandeur of the empire itself. While flamingo tongue recipes are rare in surviving texts, their mention alone signals their role as a pinnacle of culinary ambition. Over time, the cult of the master chef became entwined with the identity of the household. Guests might refer not just to the generosity of their host, but to the genius of his cook, making the chef's reputation a reflection of the patron's own discernment and status. In this way, the flamingo tongue, and all the other wonders of the Roman kitchen, became more than food. It became an expression of the empire's greatest strengths, its diversity, its wealth, and its capacity to transform the farthest reaches of the known world into a single, dazzling table. For the masters of the imperial kitchen, every feast was a gamble, every dish a test. Success meant glory, failure humiliation. But for those who could navigate the fires, the rivalries, and the endless demands of their patrons, the rewards were unparalleled. Their work was fleeting, devoured in moments, yet its impact could echo for years in the halls of power. And in those moments when a platter of flamingo tongues left the kitchen, glistening, fragrant, and destined to astonish, the chef could stand, if only for an instant, as a quiet emperor of his own domain. If the Roman banquet was a theater of power, then the guests were both the audience and the actors. To be invited to such a feast was more than an honor. It was an opportunity, a moment in which alliances could be cemented, rivalries could be diffused, and one's position in the intricate social hierarchy of Rome could be displayed for all to see. But the art of being a guest was as complex as the art of hosting. Those who failed to navigate the unspoken rules risked not only embarrassment, but political ruin. The seating arrangement alone was a statement. In the triclinium, the three couches set around a low table, position was everything. The host's place was central on the central couch, flanked by those he wished to honor or impress. The further ones sat from the host, the lower one's relative status. Yet cunning hosts might place potential rivals closer to demonstrate magnanimity or to keep them under watchful eyes. A place of prominence could signal favor. But it could also be a test, an invitation to prove oneself worthy of the position. Dress was the next language spoken at the table. Roman guests knew that their attire would be noted the moment they entered. A toga too simple might suggest disrespect. One too elaborate could be seen as ostentatious or even as an attempt to overshadow the host. The finest guests balanced elegance with deference, choosing fabrics and colors that reflected their standing without drawing the wrong kind of attention. Jewelry, too, was chosen with care. A heavy gold torque might speak of wealth, but a discreet cameo of a favored deity could suggest piety and taste. Once seated, conversation was as much a weapon as any legion's sword. Guests were expected to display wit, learning, and charm without dominating the discourse. A well-timed anecdote about a recent Senate debate, a clever quotation from Virgil, or a comment on the seasoning of a dish could all win approval. But sharp tongues were dangerous. An insult, even veiled, could spark a feud that lingered long after the last course. Silence, on the other hand, could be interpreted as ignorance or disdain. The art lay in reading the room, knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to let another's words serve one's own ends. At the grandest banquets, the serving of flamingo tongues was a moment rich with social significance. The arrival of the dish, often borne by multiple servants and announced by music or fanfare, drew every eye. Those served first were marked as honored guests. Those served last, or with portions noticeably smaller, might quietly note the slight. It was understood that such details were intentional. In the Roman world, the table was a ledger, and every serving a calculated entry. Wine, too, was a dangerous instrument in the game. Hosts determined the ratio of wine to water, and it was a guest's task to match his drinking to the tone of the evening. To drain one's cup too quickly was to risk foolishness. To drink too little could be taken as aloofness. Skilled guests paced themselves, remaining lucid enough to engage in the shifting tides of conversation while allowing enough warmth from the wine to soften formality. There were also subtler arts at play, offering to pour for one's neighbor, raising a cup in a pointed toast, or feigning inebriation to lure a rival into indiscretion. Entertainment threaded itself through the evening, providing moments for guests to reposition themselves socially. Between courses, musicians, poets, dancers, or actors might perform. Laughter at the right moment could ally one with the host's sense of humor. Too much or too little could place one on the wrong side of the room's mood. Some guests used these intervals to move quietly between couches, offering a word to the host, a compliment to his wife, or a murmur of agreement to a political ally. The banquet was a battlefield fought not with spears, but with smiles and subtlety. Etiquette extended even to the handling of the food itself. While some delicacies could be eaten with the fingers, others required a spoon or knife. To mishandle a rare item, to drop a morsel of flamingo tongue or fail to appreciate its seasoning, was to display a lack of refinement. Equally, one must not appear too greedy. Lingering too long over a favored dish could be read as gluttony, a moral failing in Roman eyes. The ideal guest praised each offering while never seeming to crave it. The conclusion of the banquet was as important as its beginning. Rising too early could be seen as an insult, implying boredom or other pressing engagements. Staying too long risked overstaying one's welcome and intruding on the private hours of the household. The most skilled guests departed at a moment that allowed their presence to be remembered fondly, their absence noted without irritation. A final compliment to the host, a word of thanks to the staff, and a graceful exit could ensure an invitation to the next gathering, or even secure a place in the host's favor for years to come. For many, the banquet was a stage on which they might rise in the host's estimation. For others, it was a test, a minefield where a single misstep could undo years of careful networking. Yet for all its dangers, the allure of the feast was irresistible. In the soft light of the oil lamps, with music in the air and the scent of roasted meats and exotic spices lingering, the banquet offered a vision of Rome at its height. A world where power was as much about perception as about decree, where every smile, every seat, every bite was a move in the endless game of influence. And when the flamingo tongues were cleared away and the guests filed into the night, each carrying their own impressions and ambitions, the true feast began. The quiet savoring of gained advantage, the calculation of new opportunities, the plotting of tomorrow's alliances. For the art of the guest did not end with the meal. It continued long after, in whispered conversations, in letters written by lamplight, and in the shifting fortunes of those who knew that in Rome, to dine well was to live well. To understand how a Roman noble could place a dish of flamingo tongues before his guests, one must trace the web of commerce and conquest that fed the city's insatiable appetite. Rome's banquets were not merely displays of individual wealth. They were the final, glittering link in a vast chain that stretched across seas, deserts, and mountains, binding distant lands to the heart of the empire through trade, tribute, and the will of legions. The flamingo itself was not native to the Italian peninsula in the abundance required for such indulgence. True, a few flocks graced the marshes of Etruria or the coastal lagoons of Campania, but their numbers were insufficient to sustain the demand of Rome's elite. The most prized tongues came from birds in the Nile Delta, the salt lagoons of North Africa, and the warm, shallow waters of the eastern Mediterranean. From these distant shores, they were captured, slaughtered, and their tongues carefully preserved, often in wine, vinegar, or brine. For the long journey to the capital, the process began with hunters and fishermen who knew the seasonal habits of the flamingo. Their work was dangerous, requiring patience and skill to approach the wary birds. In North Africa, they would wade into briny lagoons under the scorching sun, moving slowly to avoid startling the flocks. Once taken, the birds were plucked and the tongues removed with precision. These delicate morsels were then packed with spices, pepper from India, cinnamon from Arabia, to preserve flavor and prevent spoilage during transit. From the coast, the preserved tongues traveled along trade routes maintained as much by Rome's military might as by its merchants' coin. Galleys carried them across the Mediterranean, often alongside amphorae of wine, sacks of grain, and amphorae filled with garum, the fermented fish sauce beloved by Roman palates. In major ports such as Ostia, goods were offloaded, assessed for taxes, and distributed to the markets and private storehouses of the city. Here, brokers and dealers, often freedmen who had risen to wealth through trade, negotiated prices and quantities, ensuring that only the finest specimens reached the villas of the elite. But flamingo tongues were only one jewel in a banquet's crown. The same networks that brought them to Rome also supplied dates from Judea, oysters from Britannia, figs from Smyrna, and the marble-top tables on which these luxuries were displayed. The logistical complexity was staggering. Fleets had to be maintained, roads patrolled, warehouses guarded. Each delicacy was a testament not just to the reach of Rome's economy, but to the order imposed by its governance. Without secure borders, the goods would not flow. Without roads and ships, they would not arrive fresh enough to dazzle the senses. The trade in such delicacies also reveals the inequality that defined the empire. While nobles dined on exotic fare, the laborers who harvested it lived lives of hardship. African hunters risked disease in mosquito-filled marshes, sailors endured storms and the constant threat of pirates. Dockworkers strained under the weight of cargo. For them, the banquet was an abstraction, an event spoken of in rumor, never experienced firsthand. The wealth generated by this trade rarely returned to their hands, flowing instead to merchants, senators, and imperial coffers. Economic demand for such rare foods created entire industries in distant provinces. In Cyrenaica, coastal towns became known for their expertise in processing flamingo tongues, just as others specialized in olive oil or purple dye. Seasonal festivals in these towns often coincided with the height of the flamingo harvest, blending local traditions with the rhythms of imperial commerce. In these moments, the influence of Rome was tangible, not just in the taxes paid or the goods shipped, but in the reshaping of local economies to serve the desires of a city hundreds of miles away. The imperial appetite was also a political tool. Governors in far-flung provinces often sent rare delicacies to the emperor or powerful senators as a form of tribute, ensuring favor and protection. A crate of flamingo tongues from a loyal province could be as effective as a military pledge, a reminder that the governor was both capable of securing luxury and willing to share it with the heart of power. In this way, the banquet table became an extension of diplomacy, a stage where food spoke the language of loyalty. The cost of such goods was immense, but their value lay not in their price alone. A host who could serve flamingo tongues signaled not only that he could afford them, but that he commanded the connections to acquire them. It was proof of a network of allies, clients, and traders, a quiet assertion that his reach extended to the furthest edges of Rome's dominion. Even the manner in which the dish was introduced at table, the servants' costumes, the music, the choice of plate, reinforced the host's image as a man whose influence was woven through the empire's arteries. Yet beneath the glamour lay fragility. A failed harvest, a pirate raid, a political dispute in a distant province could sever a supply line, leaving the banquet table bereft of its most dazzling ornaments. In this sense, the luxury of flamingo tongues was as much a reminder of Rome's vulnerability as of its power. The empire's appetite depended on the steady function of its vast machinery, a machinery that could falter if neglected or challenged. In the end, each flamingo tongue consumed at a banquet was more than food. It was a symbol of conquest, of commerce, and of the delicate balance that sustained Rome's grandeur. From the marshes of Africa to the marbled halls of the capital, it represented the invisible threads binding together a world in which the desires of a few could shape the labors of many. The guest who savored such a morsel might never consider the chain of events that brought it to his lips, but the host knew, and it was that knowledge, as much as the flavor, that gave the dish its power. In Rome, the banquet table was more than a place to eat. It was a council chamber without walls, a theater without a stage, and a battlefield without swords. Here, in the glow of oil lamps and the hum of lyres, power shifted hands not through decrees or legions, but through morsels of food and the calculated placement of guests. The art of hosting was an extension of political life, and mastery of it could elevate a man's influence as surely as a victory in the forum. For the ambitious senator, an invitation to dine was a summons to a subtle contest. The choice of venue, the opulence of the triclinium, the quality of the wine and the rarity of the dishes, All were scrutinized and discussed long after the meal ended. To serve flamingo tongues, rare spices, and wines aged in amphorae sealed before the host's own birth was to declare, without words, that one's resources and connections were without rival. In this way, the banquet became a visual and sensory manifesto, each course a clause in an unspoken political argument. The seating arrangements alone could signal shifting allegiances or impending rivalries. In the Roman dining tradition, the lectus medius, the central couch, was the position of greatest honor, reserved for the most distinguished guest or ally whose favor the host sought to secure. Flanking positions reflected descending ranks of importance. A senator who found himself demoted to a less prominent place might sense the chill of political disfavor before any official move was made. The invitation list was equally strategic. To gather allies and exclude rivals was to create a visible coalition, one that could influence Senate debates or sway public opinion. A carefully orchestrated dinner might bring together influential generals, powerful equestrians, and foreign dignitaries in the same room, each one subtly reminded of the host's ability to convene power. The absence of certain figures was as deliberate as the presence of others, a silent signal that could reverberate through Rome's political networks. Even the entertainment carried political weight. A troupe of actors might perform scenes from Rome's legendary past, reinforcing values the host wished to promote. Poets could recite verses praising the glory of the empire, and by extension, the wisdom of those in attendance. Exotic animals were sometimes brought into the triclinium, not merely as curiosities, but as living emblems of Rome's reach. To serve flamingo tongues while a living peacock strutted through the room was to embody, in miniature, the empire's mastery over both land and sea. The feast was also an arena for more subtle forms of influence. A host might arrange for certain guests to sit side by side, encouraging private conversations that could lead to alliances or deals. Gifts, slipped discreetly into the hands of departing guests, could ensure loyalty in future Senate votes. The very act of generosity, of lavishing attention and resources on others, created a bond of obligation that might be called upon when political storms gathered. In this world, culinary extravagance was a calculated risk. Too modest a spread could signal weakness or parsimony. Too ostentatious a display might invite whispers of arrogance or corruption. The finest hosts navigated this tension with precision, ensuring that each dish, no matter how exotic, felt like part of a harmonious whole. A platter of flamingo tongues was never served in isolation. It appeared at the precise moment when conversation lulled and curiosity was ready to be reignited, accompanied by a story of its journey from distant shores. The connection between politics and dining extended to the imperial court. Emperors themselves hosted elaborate feasts, using them as a means to display the bounty of the empire and to remind senators and generals of their dependence on imperial favor. An invitation to dine with the emperor was an honor beyond measure, but it was also a summons to demonstrate loyalty. Refusing such an invitation, unless gravely ill or absent from the city, could be construed as an act of defiance. The political potency of the banquet was not lost on Rome's satirists, who mocked the excesses of the wealthy and the sycophancy of their guests. Poets such as Juvenal and Martial penned verses that skewered the hypocrisy of those who professed virtue in public while indulging in decadent feasts behind closed doors. Yet even their biting words acknowledged the reality that in Rome, the road to power often ran through the triclinium. Beneath the grandeur, there was a fragile human element to these feasts. The host, no matter how powerful, was vulnerable to the judgment of his peers. A poorly executed banquet, a dish that arrived cold, a wine that soured, could linger in the collective memory, undermining the very prestige it sought to enhance. Conversely, a flawlessly orchestrated evening could cement alliances that lasted for years, its memory becoming a shared reference point among those who had attended. The political feast demanded an acute awareness of Rome's social currents. A host needed to know which generals were feuding, which senators were courting popular favor, which merchants had the ear of the Praetorian Guard. Misplacing a guest or serving a dish associated with a rival could have unintended consequences. The flamingo tongue, for all its rarity, could not redeem a blunder in the delicate choreography of the evening. Over time, the tradition of the political feast became as entrenched as the rituals of the Senate itself. Generations of Romans learned that influence was cultivated not only in the public arena, but in the intimate setting of the dining couch. Here, ambition was fed alongside roasted meats. Here, alliances were sealed over cups of Falernian wine. Here, the fate of provinces and armies might be shaped by the subtle pressures of hospitality. In the candlelit quiet after the last guest departed, the triclinium told the tale of the evening's successes and failures. Crumbs and empty dishes bore witness to moments of laughter, persuasion, and silent calculation. For the Roman elite, to host such a banquet was to engage in a form of governance, not of laws and edicts, but of relationships and perceptions. The Flamingo tongue, in this setting, was more than a delicacy. It was a statement of reach, refinement, and readiness to play the game of power at its most delicate level. Behind every glittering Roman banquet lay an invisible army. The polished marble floors of the triclinium, the precise arrangement of silver platters, the seamless arrival of each course. None of these were the spontaneous flourish of a wealthy host. They were the product of meticulous planning and the labor of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individuals whose names would never be inscribed on monuments or recorded in Senate decrees. Yet without them, the spectacle would collapse. The chain began far from Rome itself. Procurers and traders scoured the empire for ingredients worthy of a noble table. Flamingos were not plucked from the Tiber's banks, but from far-off wetlands and lagoons, sometimes in Africa's delta marshes, sometimes along the salt flats of Hispania or the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. They traveled in cages, tended by handlers who understood the delicacy of their cargo. Spices came from even farther: cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, and silphium, a now extinct herb treasured for its flavor, from the coasts of Cyrenaica. Each ingredient was a link in a chain that stretched across Rome's provinces, carried by ships, pack animals, and human porters. At the heart of the operation was the archimagirus, the master chef. This figure was not a mere cook, but a commander in his own right, directing a brigade of kitchen slaves and freedmen with military precision. The Roman kitchen was a hot, smoky, and dangerous environment, filled with the scent of roasting meats and the constant clang of bronze and iron. Fires had to be maintained at exact heats, sauces stirred without pause, exotic birds prepared so that their meat remained moist, their presentation flawless. The flamingo tongue, for example, had to be removed with care, seasoned delicately, and served at the precise moment when its texture was most tender. The archimagirus understood that his work was not just about flavor, but about timing and drama. He knew when the conversation in the triclinium might flag, and he would coordinate with the structories, the carvers, to bring in the next course with theatrical flourish. These carvers were specialists, trained to slice meats in intricate patterns, ensuring that the first visual impression matched the luxury of the taste. To see a structor cut a roasted peacock so that its iridescent feathers still framed the meat was to witness a performance as skilled as any in the amphitheater. Serving the guests required another layer of expertise. The ministry, attendants who moved silently among the couches, carried platters, refilled cups, and responded to gestures so subtle that outsiders might miss them entirely. A tilt of the head could summon wine. A flick of the fingers could replace a dish. Their movements were rehearsed, their paths choreographed to avoid collisions or delays. A guest might never notice the ministry unless they faltered. And to falter was to risk the displeasure of the host. The logistical demands were staggering. Wine amphorae had to be uncorked hours in advance to breathe, yet kept at a temperature suitable for the season. Ice, rare and precious, could be brought from mountain snowfields in insulated containers for chilling drinks in summer. Fresh water had to be drawn for mixing with wine, a custom that separated the civilized Roman from the barbarian. Platters, cups, and utensils were polished to mirror brightness, each one a reflection of the host's wealth. Outside the kitchen, scribes and stewards managed inventories, payments, and procurement schedules. A single banquet could consume the equivalent of months of wages for a laborer. The host might never speak directly to the traders or farmers who supplied his table, but their work was essential to the illusion of effortless abundance. Even the house itself was part of the machinery. The triclinium was often designed with hidden doors and corridors that allowed servants to appear and vanish without intruding on the guest's view. Storerooms were strategically placed so that dishes could be brought in quickly, their scents wafting ahead to tease the appetite. Lighting was arranged to highlight the food and the guests' faces, creating an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy, even in vast halls. Training the staff was an ongoing process. Young slaves learned the art of pouring wine without spilling a drop, carrying trays with perfect balance, and anticipating a guest's needs before they were voiced. Those who excelled could rise in status, gaining positions of trust within the household. Freedmen who had served in the kitchens or as stewards might go on to manage estates or run profitable businesses, their fortunes built on the skills honed in service of the banquet. The cost of maintaining such a machine was immense, but for Rome's elite, it was a necessary investment. A banquet was a statement of power, and power required constant reinforcement. The appearance of ease, that a host could summon flamingo tongues and silphium at a whim, was the product of endless effort behind the scenes. Yet this machinery was fragile. A shipment delayed by storms, a kitchen fire, or the illness of a key servant could disrupt the entire evening. Roman hosts were adept at improvisation, substituting one exotic delicacy for another, but they knew that consistency was the foundation of reputation. The guests might forgive a missing dish once. Repeated failures could tarnish a name. The hidden machinery also had its politics. A favored cook could influence menu choices, subtly shaping the flavors associated with a host's table. A steward with a network of traders could secure ingredients others found impossible to obtain. Even among the servants, alliances and rivalries formed, their own hierarchies reflecting the society they served. In the end, the grandeur of a Roman banquet rested on the shoulders of those unseen. The guests reclined on couches, sipping wine and marveling at the abundance, rarely thinking of the hands that had plucked the grapes, the backs that had carried the amphory, the sweat that had seasoned the kitchen air. Yet without those hands and backs, without the constant hum of labor in the shadows, the triclinium would be silent, the platters empty, and the flamingo tongues nothing more than a distant fantasy. To understand the machinery behind these feasts is to glimpse the true scope of Roman opulence, not merely in gold and marble, but in the human effort that sustained it. The banquet was a living organism, and every servant, supplier, and craftsman was a cell within it, working in concert to produce an evening that would be remembered long after the last crumbs were cleared away. For every noble reclining on a couch in a perfumed triclinium, savoring the tender bite of a flamingo tongue, there were many in Rome who saw such indulgence as the clearest sign of the empire's moral decay. The banquets of the elite did not exist in a vacuum. They played out against a city where the majority lived in cramped insulate, surviving on bread, olives, and cheap wine. The contrast was too glaring to escape notice, and in the words of Rome's poets, historians, and moralists, the banquet became both a symbol of refinement and a target for ridicule. Writers such as Juvenal turned the excesses of the table into fodder for biting satire. In his satires, he paints scenes where the wealthy gorge themselves on exotic delicacies while the common citizen scrounges for scraps. For him, the flamingo tongue was not a triumph of culinary art, but an emblem of waste, a perversion of natural abundance. To devour such a thing was to proclaim, without shame, that one's wealth was measured not by generosity or virtue, but by the ability to destroy beauty for the sake of novelty. Juvenal's wit was sharp, but his underlying warning was clear. A society that prizes extravagance over moderation is courting its own ruin. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and advisor to emperors, approached the issue with the gravity of moral philosophy. He lamented that Rome had become a place where the belly has become the master, where men measured their worth by the extravagance of their meals rather than the clarity of their thought or the strength of their character. In his essays and letters, Seneca invoked examples from the Republic when generals and statesmen were said to have dined simply, sustaining themselves for the sake of service rather than indulgence. The flamingo tongue, to him, represented the very opposite of Stoic virtue, an enslavement to desire, a distraction from the pursuit of wisdom. Not all voices condemn the practice. Martial, the poet of epigrams, could turn the flamingo tongue into a playful emblem of luxury, a wink to those who understood that pleasure was as much a part of life as duty. In his verses, the exotic dish could be a lover's gift, a gesture of friendship, or a symbol of the host's ability to surprise and delight. For Marshall, the art of the banquet lay in its ability to create memories and bind people together, however fleeting the moment. Among the historians, Pliny the Elder documented such curiosities with a blend of fascination and skepticism. In his Natural History, he notes the popularity of flamingo tongues among the wealthy, but his tone suggests a certain disbelief that such a thing should be prized above more practical fare. His approach reflects the encyclopedic mind, curious about the origins, preparation, and rarity of the dish, yet unwilling to lavish it with uncritical praise. The public reaction was more complex. Many in the lower classes admired the sheer scale of the feasts, if only from a distance. Stories of golden goblets, crystal dishes, and endless courses fed the imagination, and some would crowd outside the estates of the wealthy during a banquet, hoping to catch a glimpse of the spectacle or to receive leftovers through the back gates. These sportually, small gifts of food or coin distributed to clients and dependents could transform a noble's feast into an act of patronage, a way of converting luxury into loyalty. Yet admiration often mingled with resentment. When grain shipments faltered or the cost of bread rose, the sight of nobles importing flamingos from Africa could inflame public anger. Riots in the Forum were not unknown when the gap between the tables of the elite and the stomachs of the people became too wide. Political rivals could seize upon such moments, portraying their opponents as gluttons and wastrels. In an age when reputation was as fragile as glass, the choice of what to serve at a banquet could have consequences far beyond the dining hall. The theater, too, became a mirror for these tensions. Comic plays might portray an absurdly rich character boasting of his flamingo tongues, only to be undone by his own vanity. Audiences laughed, but the laughter carried an edge. It was the humor of those who saw in the stage's caricatures a reflection of their own world's injustices. Religious voices added another layer of critique. As Rome absorbed foreign cults and philosophies, some priests and moral leaders argued for temperance as a form of piety. The old Roman virtues, frugalitas, frugality, and gravitas, seriousness, were invoked as counters to the creeping tide of extravagance. To sacrifice a flamingo to the gods might be acceptable, but to eat its tongue for personal pleasure was seen by some as sacrilege, a misdirection of the sacred into the profane. Still, the elite persisted. For them, the banquet was not merely about personal indulgence, but about the performance of their role in society. A senator who failed to impress his peers at table could find his influence diminished. A general returning from campaign was expected to demonstrate his success, not only through military trophies, but through the abundance he could lay before his guests. In this sense, flamingo tongues were as much a weapon in the arena of politics as any speech in the Senate. What emerges from these voices, whether in satire, philosophy, poetry, history, or public opinion, is the understanding that food was never just food in Rome. It was a language, a symbol, a tool. The flamingo tongue was a syllable in that language, one that could mean beauty, waste, refinement, or decadence, depending on who was speaking. To read the words of Rome's commentators is to see the banquet through many eyes. The moralists, who fears for the soul of the city. The poets, who delights in the pleasures of the moment. The historians, who records without judgment. The commoners, who dreams of a taste he will never have. In that chorus of perspectives, the flamingo tongue becomes more than a culinary curiosity. It becomes a lens through which we glimpse the contradictions of Rome itself, a civilization capable of greatness and folly in the same breath. The decline of the Roman banquet did not happen overnight, nor was it the result of a single decree or moment of moral awakening. It was instead a slow unraveling, a process in which economic strain, political instability, and cultural transformation combined to dim the glow of the triclinium. In the late Republic and the height of the Empire, a nobleman's feast might have been a dazzling display of silver platters, crystal goblets, and exotic dishes drawn from the farthest corners of the empire. But by the later centuries, the lavishness that once defined Rome's elite dining began to wane, replaced by a more uncertain rhythm. One of the first blows to extravagance came from within the political sphere. Periodically, leaders sought to impose sumptuary laws, regulations meant to curb excessive spending on banquets and luxury goods. These laws were often framed as moral restorations, appeals to the virtues of the early republic, when Rome's leaders supposedly ate simply and served the state before themselves. Although such laws were notoriously difficult to enforce, they did cast a shadow over the culture of opulence. A host who ignored them risked being painted as decadent, careless of the state's moral fiber, and vulnerable to political attack. Economic realities bit deeper still. The later empire faced rising military costs, administrative bloat, and the disruption of long-distance trade routes. Imports that once flowed freely, spices from Arabia, wines from Greece, flamingos from North Africa, became more expensive and less reliable. The logistics of maintaining a steady supply of such luxuries strained even the wealthiest estates. Merchants who had once profited from the demands of elite banquets began to focus on goods with steadier demand, leaving some delicacies to fade from the marketplace. Shifting tastes also played a role. As Christianity grew from a persecuted sect to the dominant religion of the empire, it brought with it new ideas about modesty, temperance, and the moral meaning of food. Feasting itself was not condemned. Indeed, the Christian calendar embraced moments of celebration. But the ostentatious consumption of rare creatures for personal glory sat uneasily with the faith's emphasis on humility and care for the poor. Church leaders spoke against wastefulness, urging the wealthy to see their resources as a trust to be shared, not flaunted. Under such influence, dishes like flamingo tongues became less symbols of status and more relics of a pagan past. The cultural prestige of the convivium also shifted. In the age of Cicero or Augustus, the banquet was a stage for intellectual exchange as much as for indulgence. Poets recited verses, philosophers debated ethics, and political alliances were forged over platters of rare meats. But in the later centuries, the instability of the empire's politics made such gatherings more dangerous. Trust was eroded. The wrong guest could be an informer. The wrong word could lead to ruin. Without the same level of intellectual and political vitality, the banquet's role in elite society began to contract. There were still moments of grandeur, particularly in the courts of powerful emperors and provincial governors. In Constantinople, the imperial table retained much of its splendor, drawing upon the trade networks of the eastern Mediterranean. But even there, the tastes of the court leaned toward different forms of luxury: elaborate sugar confections, intricate bread sculptures, and rich stews, rather than the calculated shock of serving something as peculiar as flamingo tongues. The symbolism shifted. Refinement came to mean complexity and artistry rather than rarity and destruction. Archaeological evidence mirrors this change. Excavations of later Roman and early Byzantine dining sites reveal fewer remains of exotic species and a greater emphasis on regional fare. While amphorae of imported wines and oils still appear, the bones of animals like flamingos become scarce, suggesting either that demand had collapsed or that the cost of supply had grown prohibitive. Inscriptions celebrating feasts also become rarer. Where once hosts proudly recorded the lists of delicacies served, later dedications speak more of generosity in bread distribution or public works. Some of the decline was also simply a matter of memory. Younger generations, raised in an era of different values and constraints, no longer saw the flamingo tongue as a pinnacle of taste. They might have known of it from literature or family tales, but without personal experience of such dishes, their allure faded. The flamingo became once again a bird of wetlands and riverbanks, admired for its color and grace rather than its suitability for the table. Even so, the ghost of those extravagant feasts lingered. In private letters, in the works of nostalgic historians, and in the half-critical, half-longing accounts of moralists, the old banquets retained a strange power. They were reminders of a time when Rome could command the resources of half the known world, when its elite measured themselves against the horizon and sought to possess even the most fleeting luxuries. For some, this was a cautionary tale, proof that excess leads inevitably to decline. For others, it was a story of ambition and daring, of a civilization unafraid to turn the farthest corners of the earth into a reflection of itself. In the end, The flamingo tongue's disappearance from the Roman table was neither purely a moral victory nor wholly a sign of collapse. It was the result of a changing world, one in which the symbols of power shifted, the networks of trade evolved, and the meanings of luxury were rewritten. The triclinium, once a theater of imperial might, adapted or vanished, its couches replaced by simpler tables, its courses trimmed to suit a leaner age. Yet the memory of those opulent nights did not vanish. Like the marble ruins that still rose above the Forum, they stood as monuments to Rome's capacity for both grandeur and folly. And in that memory, the flamingo tongue, absurd, delicate, and unforgettable, remained a perfect emblem of the banquet's rise and fall. Long after the last flamingo tongue was served in a Roman triclinium, the legend of such banquets continued to ripple through history. In medieval manuscripts, moralists and monks recorded them as examples of pagan excess, often alongside tales of Nero's fiddling or Caligula's eccentricities. To these chroniclers, the flamingo tongue was not merely a dish but a parable, a morsel of decadence that spoke to the moral fragility of empires. Yet, stripped of the moralizing tone, such accounts also carried an undercurrent of fascination. Even those who condemned the practice could not entirely suppress a certain wonder at the audacity of a civilization that would make a bird's tongue into a symbol of supreme refinement. The Renaissance brought a revival of classical texts, and with them, a renewed interest in the details of Roman life. Scholars like Poggio Bracciolini and later antiquarians devoured the writings of Pliny, Martial, and Apicius, parsing their words for glimpses of a lost world. In the courts of Florence, Venice, and later Paris, patrons commissioned paintings of Roman banquets, canvases alive with the glow of oil lamps, the gleam of silver, and the improbable sight of servants bearing trays laden with pink tongues. These were not menus to be followed, but images to be admired, trophies of an intellectual conquest over the past. Yet some took the inspiration further. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as European explorers expanded the map, there were whispered experiments in reviving ancient recipes. A few aristocrats with access to exotic birds tried to recreate the fabled dish, though flamingos were no longer the common quarry they had been in Roman Africa. These attempts were often more about theater than authenticity, staged for masks and themed feasts where guests dressed as senators or empresses. The flamingo tongue, whether genuine or simulated, served as a bridge between worlds, a taste of Rome conjured for the delight of those who sought to wear its mantle. In literature, the motif persisted. Playwrights and satirists invoked the flamingo tongue as shorthand for absurd luxury, a way to mock the appetites of the powerful. In the 18th and 19th centuries, with the rise of archaeology as a scientific discipline, excavations of Roman villas and dining rooms gave physical form to these stories. Triclinium mosaics, fragments of fine tableware, and animal bones confirmed that exotic birds had indeed been part of Rome's culinary repertoire. Each find seemed to blur the line between legend and fact, rooting the flamingo tongue more firmly in the realm of historical possibility. Modern science has added further texture to the picture. Zooarchaeological analysis of bone deposits in sites like Pompeii and Herculaneum has identified flamingo remains among the detritus of kitchens and drains. The skeletal evidence, coupled with ancient recipe fragments, suggests that the tongues were prepared with careful seasoning, perhaps boiled with herbs, then grilled and drizzled with garum. It is a detail at once mundane and astonishing, collapsing the centuries between the plate of a Roman patrician and the laboratory table of a modern researcher. But the flamingo tongue has also found a place in popular imagination far beyond the scholar's study. In television documentaries, historical novels, and even culinary fantasy, it has become a symbol of the bizarre extremes of ancient gastronomy. Chefs experimenting with archeo cuisine have toyed with creating visually suggestive but ethically acceptable imitations, using cured fish roe, beet-infused chicken strips, or sculpted vegetables, to evoke the look and feel without harming a rare species. In this way, the dish has been transformed once again from an actual indulgence into an edible story. The irony is that, in its afterlife, the flamingo tongue has perhaps become more famous than it ever was in its own time. In the 1st century, it was a rare indulgence for a few dozen tables in a city of 1 million souls. Today, it is part of the global shorthand for Roman luxury, invoked alongside vomitoria, a misunderstood term, and orgiastic feasts to paint a picture of a civilization at once magnificent and doomed. The reality, as always, is more complex. Rome's greatness was built not only on such excess, but on systems of trade, governance, and culture that endured far longer than any banquet. Still, there is a reason the image persists. The flamingo tongue, in its fragility and improbability, captures something essential about the human impulse to transform the rare into the personal. It speaks to the way civilizations mark their heights, not only with monuments of stone, but with fleeting acts of display, meals consumed in an evening yet remembered for centuries. The Romans, with their genius for theater and symbolism, understood this instinct well. They knew that a banquet could be as much a monument as an arch or a temple, provided it was spoken of, written about, and remembered. In that sense, every retelling, from the annals of Tacitus to the scripts of modern documentaries, is a continuation of the banquet itself. Each mention revives the table, the torchlight, the expectant gaze of guests as the platter is borne in. Across 2 millennia, the flamingo tongue has outlived the empire that craved it, migrating from the dining couch to the page, from the page to the screen, from reality to myth and back again. And so, in the long banquet hall of history, its place is set still, awaiting those curious enough to take a seat. The flamingo tongue, now absent from our tables, endures as one of history's most vivid symbols of how power, culture, and appetite intertwine. To the Romans who could afford it, this delicate morsel was more than sustenance. It was an edible proclamation, a statement that their influence could reach across seas, marshes, and continents to bend nature's rarest creatures toward the whims of their table. To serve such a dish was to embody the empire's very ethos, the belief that nothing, from the stones of distant cities to the smallest curve of a bird's tongue, lay beyond their grasp. Today, the notion of eating such a thing might spark revulsion, curiosity, or both. But this reaction underscores the strange truth of history. It is often the smallest details that survive longest in cultural memory. Empires rise and fall, laws are repealed, monuments crumble, but a taste, a color, or a single dish can endure as a shorthand for an entire way of life. The flamingo tongue, roasted and dusted with spices, stands as a distillation of Rome's contradictions, its brilliance and brutality, its innovation and its excess. Yet to dwell solely on the extravagance is to miss the larger story. Behind every Roman banquet lay a network of trade routes, skilled cooks, hunters, and servants, each playing a part in transforming raw nature into a spectacle of refinement. The dish was a final flourish atop a vast machinery of labor, artistry, and logistics, a reminder that what seems like a fleeting indulgence is often the visible crest of a much deeper wave. In reflecting on the flamingo tongue's long afterlife in our imagination, we are reminded that history is as much about what we choose to remember as it is about what happened. The dish survives because it speaks to timeless themes, the human desire to impress, to indulge, to reach beyond the ordinary. It is a mirror, showing us not only the Romans, but ourselves. Our own symbols of status, our own ways of displaying abundance, and the judgments future generations might pass on them. The flamingo tongue's journey from the marshes of Africa to the marbled dining rooms of Rome, and then through centuries of retelling, reveals how stories themselves are feasts. They are prepared, presented, consumed, and then passed on, altered slightly with each telling. We inherit not the taste, but the idea, and in that way the banquet is never truly over. In the end, perhaps the greatest legacy of the flamingo tongue is not its flavor, but its capacity to provoke thought. It invites us to consider what our own civilizations will be remembered for, which objects, practices, or taste will one day stand as emblems of our era. Will they inspire admiration, mockery, or wonder? Will they be cautionary tales, or simply curiosities for the archaeologists of the future? Rome's flamingo tongues have long since turned to dust, but the story remains, gleaming in the light of history like a silver platter carried into a grand dining hall. And as long as we are drawn to tales of human ambition, ingenuity, and excess, that platter will never be empty.